Okay, so let's review all the materials you need to put together your floss keeper. So going through the material list, the first thing you're going to need is your Pelon foam fusible interfacing. You're going to need some vinyl. I use 16 gauge. I link everything. I give you the details for it in your pattern, as well as everything has links inside this exclusive video tutorial if you just want to click and buy. So I've got the vinyl. Mine's already pre-cut, but we're just going over the materials right now. And then you're going to need 4 fabrics. One for the outside cover, one for the inside, one for the binding, and one for the bobbin vinyl strips, plus your elastic closure. This is a great stash buster project because, as you can see, I haven't pre-cut anything, but this is just, I went through my scraps, gave it a good press, but these were just like fat quarters that I had left over from a pack, or some scrap binding that I hadn't used. So these are the ingredients, and now I'm going to go and get everything cut to size. Okay, so let's just review. Now I've gone and I've cut my materials based on the pattern sizes indicated. So let's just review and match up the materials with an actual finished product. So this is one of my finished floss keepers. And so it's got the flap elastic closure to keep it closed. And you open it up and it has 30 pockets to put your bobbinated floss in. So what you're gonna need, again, let's just review. So the outer cover, this was a patchwork, so you can also get fun and funky and make a quilted, a patchwork exterior. But for this tutorial, we're just gonna use a plain fabric. So I have cut my Redbird fabric, 11 by 14 for the outside. I've got my green polka dots for the inside, also 11 by 14, and that matches my Pelon interfacing, 11 by 14. The next thing we want to make sure we have is the bias binding. So you see there's 6 vinyl strips. Remember, we talked about those. I already have them pre-cut. There's 6 of them. They're 2 1/4 by 15. I just like to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. I'm going to cut off the excess during the assembly process. So I need 6 that are 2 1/4 by 15. So I've got those. And now the bias binding. So you have a couple options here. I have a bias binding tape measure maker that I use, so that way my bias can be fun and coordinate with the fabrics. You can also, if you wanted to, you can buy bias tape just off the shelf at a big box store. But if you're not using a pre-bought bias tape, you want a 3/4 inch bias tape. So that means you're going to cut your strips 1.5 inches. And I am going to insert a little insert of me making the bias tape just in case you can't get this exact maker anymore. It's out of production, but you can buy an attachment that will go to just a regular iron. And I really, like I said, I really enjoy making fun and funky bias tape. It's a great stash buster, as well as it coordinates. It just gives you that little extra effort. So I need my bias binding. Now you only need total of 90 inches because it's 15 times 6. But what I do is I go ahead and always cut extra. Like I said, this was a scrap buster. And so I ended up pulling this red for my bias tape, and it's just 3 widths of fabric, 1.5 inches wide. And so that's that one. And then the last piece you're going to need is your binding, whatever fabric you're going to use for your binding to finish her off. And again, this is something where you're really only going to need 55 give or so inches to go around the perimeter of your floss keeper. So this is a great if you have some extra quilt binding from when you finished a quilt and you had some extra left over. You could make this scrappy and piece a couple leftovers together. I just went ahead and I cut 2 widths of fabric from that scrap that I pulled. And then I've got my elastic band from this great Amazon package. I will link this down below. It was an assortment pack, I think, of 40 different 1-yard colors. It's a great just to have in my stash. So I just pulled the green that I liked best to go on the cover with those cute red birds. So what I'm going to do now that I've got all my pieces put together, I'm going to go ahead and make the bias tape. So let's get that started. All right, so I've got my bias tape over here and I got your maker. This is a Simplicity bias tape maker. Like I said, I don't think you can buy the actual machine anymore, but what you can get are these feeder strips. And so I'm using a 3/4 feeder strip because I want a 3/4 inch bias binding. And what you do is it's an attachment, and instead of using this, so there's a hot iron underneath this surface and the machine's gonna do the work, but instead you kind of use your own iron and just pull through this little feeder strip, and that's how you can make your own. I will link Amazon attachments to get these down below. So what I'm gonna do, so I sewed my strips together. Now when I'm doing my bias tape, I just sew a straight line. I could do a bias like I do with my binding on the 90-degree quarter, but I don't feel that it's just not a step. It's a step I can skip during this piece. So I'm gonna just go ahead and run it. And it's just that easy. So all it does is it basically folds it in half and folds it in half and makes bias tape. In case you don't know what bias tape is, it's sewing the edges. Let me show you. So it's turning a 1.5 inch strip wide piece, folding it in half so the seam's right down the middle. And then when I'm going to sew it on the vinyl, I'm going to fold it just like that. So there's no exposed edges of the fabric around the vinyl bobbin. So I'm going to go ahead and finish making my bias tape, and I'll bring you over to the ironing board and show you what's next. All right, so we're going to prep now our quilt binding, the binding that's going to go around the exterior. So this one I do on a 1/4 inch 90-degree seam. So when you're sewing your strips together, in case you're not a quilter, you're going to sew your strips right sides together and on a 90-degree angle rather than just like this and doing a straight seam across. That'll give you just too much bulk in one area. If you spread that bulk across a 90-degree angle, it is a lot easier to sew your binding. So you're going to sew right here and sew from the 90-degree to this corner, and that's when you do that, you're going to get this nice, pretty seam right here where the bulk is distributed amongst this 2¼ inch strip. So again, my bias is I like to use 2¼ inch binding because I am going to machine stitch this on. This is a personal preference. If you are a quilter and you like 1 3/4 or 2.5 or 2, bias the binding around your quilt, this keeper, it's all just personal preference. But 2¼ is my standard go-to. So once I sewed those 2 strips together, now what I have to do to prep it is I'm going to just sew, or I'm going to iron the binding in half. Real easy, but I'm going to do it the whole length. And so that's going to prep that. Sorry, my iron's grunting at you. And then while I'm over here at the iron, I'm going to bring my 3 pieces and put this together. Now remember, this is Pellon double-sided foam fusible. So it's a nice thick, I like to use the foam for my floss keepers rather than just batting. It gives it that extra stability. So what you're going to want to do, remember all of these are the same exact size. They're all 11 by 14. So I'm going to lay my exterior down, put my middle, you're making a little sandwich. So you're going to put that in the middle and this on top. And then you're just going to press and hold. And that's all this interfacing needs. It's just a press and hold. Obviously, if you have a heat press, you can use that. But if not, a standard iron will get the job done. You're just slow and steady going around to make sure that you press and hold in each area of the interfacing about 10 seconds. You really can't go for too long. You can't go for not enough time. The glue won't heat up enough to activate. Do not use steam. Do not, move the iron. This is like a press. You're sitting there in one area and you're activating the glue. I am going a little fast since this is a video, but you can see I have now attached. My top is stuck and good. So I'm going to flip it over and do the back side. It does let you lift up. You can see I had to lift up just a little bit because sometimes it does, if I press hard, it does go all the way through. But you've got the options to lift it up when it's still kind of tacky. So it's not a fast drying permanent glue, but once it's not hot anymore, it will stay stuck. All right. And I do a test, nothing's flopping, so that means it's all stuck and good. So I'm gonna finish doing my binding and then we're gonna go over to the sewing machine. All right, so I brought my bias tape and my vinyl strips over to the sewing machine, and what I'm gonna do right here is just prep them to sew. So I love using Wonder Clips for this. It just holds that bias tape right where you want it on the vinyl. You do not wanna use pins with vinyl because once you put holes in a vinyl, it doesn't go away. So Wonder Clips are the perfect tool for this job. So I've got it all clipped up, and what I'm going to do is I'm using a stitch count of 2, 2.5. I like a tight stitch here. I do a little leader so I can get my thread started before I'm into the vinyl. Do a little back stitch, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch the top of this bias tape right onto the vinyl. Taking off my clips as I go. Sometimes I go ahead and pull some extra clips off and I kind of hold it taut. And then, little tip and trick for you. I actually go ahead, go to the end, do a little back stitch. I keep my needle in. And then I go ahead and I start and I feed my next piece because I feel like that's the hardest part is getting started. And so if you chain piece, just like when you're quilting, it goes a lot faster. So I'm gonna go ahead and do these 6 strips just the same like this. You can go ahead and put a couple clips in just to hold your place. But I'm gonna go ahead and get my 6 strips ready to go. All right, so I've got my 6 vinyl strips ready to go with their bias tape on the top. And so now is the hardest part. It's really not the hardest part, but it's where you need a little bit of math. So what I've got here is my Frixion heat disappearing pen. This is one of my favorite things to use for this part. So what you're going to do is you're going to mark your stitch lines so that you have the perfect spacing. Everything is symmetrical, so you know where to sew your vinyl strips and where to do those binding lines so your bobbins fit perfectly. They're all little perfect squares, all the same to pop your bobbin in. So what you're going to do is you're going to center your cover on your measuring mat, your cutting mat, and you're going to use your cutting mat lines for reference. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark center. So we want to mark 7 inches over, and we're going to do a straight line down the middle, and that is going to be our fold seam. Now, oh good. I didn't know this pen had run out of ink yet. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the straight lines. So the first thing we want to mark is 3/4 inches from the top. Now this is going to be a line that we sew. This is a quilting line just for decoration, for symmetry. We aren't going to sew a strip there, but that is our jumping off point, because from there we're going to go 2 inches down every time, and we're going to have perfect 6 strips. So 3/4 from the top. Let's make sure I didn't check. Yep, okay. Want to make sure the birds, if you have a directional fabric, you want to make sure that you started at the top. Let me line up again since I picked it up. And you're going to just mark your lines every 2 inches. You don't have to have crazy lines, but you just have to have lines good enough that you can see. But that's the magic of these Frixion pens, because they disappear here when you just put a little bit of heat on them. Now I know with vinyl, you shouldn't really iron with heat, so I just do like a splash of heat just to give you the edge. Okay, so that is the vinyl strip line. We're gonna go ahead and mark the cross lines while we're here. So with this one, we're going to mark, let me just reference, pretty sure, 2, 4, 6, yeah. So we're gonna mark 1/2 inch over from the edge, from that first line we created, another 1/2 inch over to the right. And then from there, we're going to do our 2-inch increments. So I'm gonna line it up on the even line so it's easier for me. So we're basically making 2-inch boxes. Now you'll see that the box on the edges is a little bit bigger. And why is that? Because of the binding. You have to take into account the binding overlap. So you don't want the binding to make that little pocket any smaller. Otherwise, your little bobbin won't fit. So now we've got all of our lines drawn on our fabric. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go over to the sewing machine and stitch it up. But let me show you just right here because it's a better view than over there on the sewing machine. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm gonna increase my stitch length to a wide stitch because this is quilting on the outside as well as functional on the inside. I usually do about a 3.5 stitch length on my machine, but again, whatever works for you. So like I said, the top one is just decorative. So that's just gonna be a straight stitch, no vinyl needed. Again, reference, make sure you got your top to the top. So once you've got your first top stitch down, then what you're going to do is you're going to take your vinyl strip, cover that stitch line with this bias tape flap, and that should give you about a 1/4 inch down below. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, but hopefully you can. Right here, when you stitch on that line, you're going to be, it's about a 1/4 inch seam right there over top of the vinyl. Once you get that stitched on, you're going to go to the next one. Flap, cover, and go again. Rinse and repeat all the way down. Once you get your horizontal lines in, your flaps all done, then you're going to do your decorative stitching and you're going to stitch all the vertical lines. It's easier to go from the bottom to the top, so that way you're not worried about accidentally catching the flap of your bobbin. If you go this way, if you go down with the grain, you won't accidentally catch the flap and end up, like I said, you can't, once there's a hole in a vinyl, you can't undo it. So you just want to be slow and steady and do your lines this way after you've got it all sewn together. Again, I'll bring you over to the sewing machine, but I just wanted to explain what we're doing here on the cutting table. All right, so I'm back from the sewing machine and you can see I've got all my stitch lines. My pockets are all ready to go. The bobbin, attaching the vinyl strips gives you a nice quilted cover on the front and the back. The fold is perfect. We're getting close. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the extra. Remember, I like to just, because vinyl is tricky to sew with and sometimes getting started is a little extra, I give myself that extra inch on the vinyl strips because they're easy to just cut off at the end. And so now it's perfect and clean and I never have to worry about running out. If I cut them perfectly at 14 inches, I'd rather have extra and trim it. So that's what I just did. So now it is all ready. So the next step is going to be attaching the quilt binding. So if you're a quilter, this is just like attaching binding to a quilt. If you are not a quilter and you're like, whoa, this is going to be scary. It is not scary. I will be honest with you. It takes practice and, don't get frustrated with yourself. You'll get better as you go. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to the sewing machine. Again, you do not use pins on vinyl because the holes. So you're going to want to use Wonder clips and clip. And so I sew first on the inside, and then I flip it out on the outside is how I do my machine binding attachment. So I always start at the bottom because I want the intersection, the connection to be right here, kind of hidden in the bottom seam. So I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine and I'm going to show you, try to step by step on how I attach the binding to the floss keeper. I have my binding tape, my quilt binding. Goodness, all these terminologies. So I'm going to start in the corner and I'm going to just do a little 1/4 inch. So I sew with a 1/4 inch margin. My stitch length is still too long from when I was sewing the vinyl. I'm going to come down into the corner, stop a 1/4 inch from the corner, flip it up, put it down, and give me a nice 1/4 turn. So that way when I do my fold over, fold up, it's going to give me a nice mitered corner on the flip side. Now watch, we're going to do it again. So I'm going to try to put my foot down, 1/4 inch from the top, back stitch. Now you can see I didn't clip. That's because I've been doing this for a while, but if you feel more comfortable clipping to keep everything where it needs to, by all means do it. Come back into the corner, do my stitch cut. So you see I've got a 90 degree right there on a 45 degree. Do my little fold up and fold over. You want the fold over edge to be lined up right with the edge of your piece. And I'm going to come back and do it again. I am going to do it all 4 times just to show you. Maybe each time I do something a little bit different. I know that binding is tricky. I've been asked to do separate binding tutorials, and I will. I'm just trying to work through the to-do list. So again, I've got that 45 degree angle cut in. It just gives me a nice cheat fold as to where to get my angle cut. And then I fold and do it again. So hopefully this helps. We're close, friends. All right, so we're gonna come around the corner. I'm standing at my machine today versus sitting, so I can't use my knee bar, which is one of my favorite tools on this Juki 2010. But when I'm going from the cutting table to the sewing machine so often, many times, I just stand. Okay, and so now we're gonna come to the edges. And so I'm gonna show you the simple way. That if you wanted a nice non-bulk corner, you're gonna do that 45 degree angle cut binding like I showed you over on the ironing board. I'm gonna say that's a little more advanced. So we're not gonna do that. I'm gonna teach you, you can have bulk in one little area. You're gonna know it's there, you're gonna know where it is and be able to identify it, so it's worth the pain for me. So I'm gonna hold these 2 pieces together, right sides together. I'm gonna mark on the inside with a marker, with a pen, it doesn't matter, you're not gonna see it, the lines where they meet up. So you see I turned that corner and this is where I started. So I give myself lots of wiggle room to come over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to keep those right sides together. I'm going to line up my 2 marker lines. There's marker line 1, marker line 2, and of course keep the fabric straight. And now I know I've got a straight line. Wish I had my knee bar. Okay, so now we've got, and I'm just going to straight stitch right there. Cut my threads, cut my extra, and now my binding. So you can see it's a little taut. I always go just a smidge to the left of the line. It's better to be a little taut. The binding will stretch just that much rather than being loose. Because if you've got loose binding, then you're gonna have extra bulk. And so you're gonna end up with a pucker in your binding. or it's just going to be hard to work around. So it's better to have just a little bit of tautness to pull, because that's easy to deal with. All right, so we've got our binding sewn on the interior. What we're going to do now is we're going to come, so remember, we're going to have the front, so that means the bobbin openings on the top. So this is the front. It's a little tricky when I don't have any like discerning marks on the front. So this is the front, so this is the back. And so we're going to take our elastic. Now, if you have the project keeper pattern, you're welcome to put the flap and the Velcro if that's more of a closure that makes sense to you. Or in previous times, I have done a hand sewn button with an elaster closure, or if you wanted to just put ribbon, attach ribbon on either side and tie it closed. There's lots of different ways that you can close this keeper. This elastic is super stretchy and soft, and just to keep the folder closed. Nothing's gonna fall out. The bobbins are super tight in there. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your elastic. If you get the one that I linked to, note there's a shiny side and a matte side. So you just have to decide which side you want to be on the front cover. I like the shiny side. Well, sometimes I like matte. Nope, but this time I want shiny. So that means if I want shiny on the front, I have to put shiny down on the back. So, because when I flip it back over, it's going to be on the front. So I'm going to just cut my elastic to the size, measure it. I put it, about an inch away from the edge, because the point is to hold it closed, right? So now I'm going to sew my elastic at the top, go over it a couple times. This is going to get pulled and get some use. So you just want to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Pull it taut, so that way when it's not in use, it's not flapping around. Like I said, this is super stretchy, great elastic, so it'll stretch and hold, but you want it to be taut when you're not using it. Let me cut off my little extra. It's obviously about 11 inches, but if you pull it more taut, shorter, longer. So now I'm gonna go over to my iron, because when I flip over, I like to iron my binding this way before I flip it and clip it. But you don't have to. We'll just stay right here and clip it. So what you're gonna do now is clip it. So you could take it over. With my quilts, I usually take it over, and so I heat press the binding over the edge, so I know that it's gonna be right where I want it to be. But as a way to avoid doing that extra step, you can just put extra clips in it. And so let me just show you how to do this real quick. I'm gonna do bind two corners for you so you can see how to do the corners. I don't want to leave you in a lurch on how to do the corners on the flip side. So, of course, wonder clip all around, as you can see. All right, let's go ahead and get our sewing down. Okay, so again, remember we were using 2.5. I used 2.5 as my actual functional stitching. But again, this is more of a top quilt stitch. So I'm going to increase my stitch length. Step 1. You can see I've got my binding clips all around the exterior perimeter of the floss keeper. So what I'm going to do first is take note of where the seam line is. So you can see right here, this is my stitch line. It's actually not 1/4 inch from the edge. You can see my stitch line right there. So I want the edge of my binding to be about 1/8 of an inch over from the edge of that stitch line. Now, again, this is where it takes practice, because if you do that, if you take note of where your stitch line is and you want your binding lined up right where that is, when you flip it on the inside, your stitches on the interior binding are going to be 1/8 of an inch from the edge as well. So it's going to look nice and clean. Okay, so I just did that and didn't even tell you what I was doing. Okay, so you come down here, you're going to stitch down to the corner, you're going to fold up And because you did that 45-degree on the back side, when you fold over, the miters almost just make themselves. So you come down. So on the top stitching, I go slower because placement matters. It just gives you the nice, this is the last step of your keeper, and you just want that top stitching to be nice. And see the placement? It's right there. It's perfect. It's 1/8 of an inch from the edge on the inside, 1/8 of an inch on the outside. But like I said, that is a practice. Don't be discouraged if it's not. Oh. So obviously I got to the right to the corner. I stopped where my needle was down right at that mitered corner, lifted my foot up, and I turned the corner. So I'm just going to do the same thing on this front. Slow and steady. I use these great little tweezers. These are sewing. This is a Tula Pink tweezer with an angled edge. It kind of just holds my binding exactly where I want it. So I've got placement. I can hold it. Again, so I'm coming down to the corner and the miters just make themselves. If your backside 90-degree diagonal sew was just so. So I want my needle to stop in the down position, lift my foot up and turn. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish this and then we'll come back and I'll show you the finished product. Okay, so we're back from the sewing machine. I went and I did a quick press right along this seam just to kind of reinforce the foam to fold right there, but it doesn't naturally. Once you start playing with your keeper and using it, it'll fold great. So I've got my finished edge done. I've got my 30 bobbin holes ready for me to go ahead and pop all my project's bobbins in, close it up, use my sweet little elastic closure, and that will keep it closed up. And I can throw this into my project keepers or into my project bags, and I've got all my bobbins, all my floss ready to go. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. I can't wait to see some of the floss keepers you make and the projects that you make with them. Please tag me on Instagram if you share your projects. Happy sewing, friends.